The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Samuel Crawford's weathered shoulders as he mended the broken fence post that marked the eastern boundary of his modest ranch. At 58, his hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to rely solely on himself, each movement deliberate and economical. The barbed wire cut into his calloused palms, but he barely noticed. Physical pain had become a familiar companion over the past 2 decades. Sam paused to wipe the sweat from his brow with a faded bandana, squinting across the vast expanse of scrubland that stretched toward the distant purple mountains. This wasn't the sprawling cattle empire he had once commanded, but it was his, and that had to be enough. The modest adobe house behind him, with its red clay roof and small wooden porch, bore little resemblance to the grand homestead that had once been his pride and joy. "Easy there, Belle," he murmured to the chestnut mare grazing nearby, her ears twitching at the sound of his voice. She was one of only 12 horses he kept now, a far cry from the hundreds of head of cattle that had once roamed these lands. The economic realities of operating alone had forced him to scale back dramatically, but Belle and her companions were well cared for and seemed content with their simple existence. As the afternoon wore on, Sam found his thoughts drifting to Margaret, as they often did during these solitary moments. She would have been 54 this year, her auburn hair perhaps touched with silver, her green eyes still sparkling with the determination that had first drawn him to her at a church social in Tucson all those years ago. He could still picture her hands kneading bread in their old kitchen, flour dusting her apron while she hummed softly, a melody he could no longer remember but desperately wished he could. Thomas would have been 26 now, perhaps married with children of his own. Sam often wondered what kind of man his son would have become. Would he have inherited Margaret's gentle spirit, or Sam's stubborn streak? Would he have wanted to continue ranching, or would he have been drawn to one of the growing towns springing up across the territory? The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Sam from his reverie. He turned to see his neighbor, Carlos Mendoza, riding up the dusty path that served as his driveway. The Mexican rancher's property adjoined Sam's to the south, and despite their different backgrounds, the two men had developed a mutual respect, born of shared hardships, and the practical need for neighborly cooperation in this harsh landscape. "Buenos tardes, Samuel," Carlos called out, dismounting from his paint horse with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life in the saddle. At 45, Carlos was 13 years Sam's junior, but his dark eyes held a wisdom that spoke of his own share of struggles. "How goes the fence work?" "Slow but steady," Sam replied, setting down his tools and walking over to shake his friend's hand. "What brings you out this way? You look like a man with something weighing on his mind." Carlos nodded grimly, his weathered face creased with concern. "There's been trouble, amigo. Old Miguel Vasquez found tracks crossing his north pasture yesterday. Unshod ponies moving in single file. Apache, without question. The tribal police think it might be a small hunting party that strayed from the reservation, but—" he shrugged expressively, letting the implications hang in the air. Sam felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times over the past 20 years, whenever the subject of Apache raiders arose. He forced himself to remain calm, his voice steady when he spoke. "How many riders?" Miguel counted sign for maybe 4 or 5 horses. Could be nothing, just young men testing boundaries. But after what happened to the Henderson place last month, Carlos trailed off, knowing that Sam was well aware of the incident. A family of settlers had been robbed of their livestock and supplies, though thankfully no one had been killed. "I appreciate you letting me know," Sam said, his mind already turning to practical considerations. His rifle was clean and loaded, his ammunition was plentiful, and his horses were in good condition if he needed to ride for help. These were the automatic calculations of a man who had learned to live with constant vigilance. Carlos studied his friend's face carefully. Despite their years of friendship, there were aspects of Sam's past that remained unspoken between them, wounds too deep to probe, even with the gentle touch of genuine concern. "Perhaps you should consider staying in town for a few days, Samuel. Maria and I have plenty of room and—" "No." Sam's refusal was immediate and firm. "This is my land, Carlos. I won't be driven from it again." The words hung heavy between them, and Carlos recognized the steel in his friend's voice that brooked no argument. He had heard rumors about Sam's past, whispered fragments of a story involving loss and tragedy, but he had never pressed for details. In this harsh country, every man was entitled to his private sorrows. "Then at least be extra careful, amigo. Keep your rifle close and your eyes open, And if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." After Carlos rode away, Sam stood alone in the gathering twilight, watching the first stars appear in the vast desert sky. The conversation had stirred up memories he usually kept buried during daylight hours, but now they rose unbidden like smoke from a long-dead fire. He remembered another evening, 20 years past, when he had stood in almost this same spot with Margaret beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they watched Thomas chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The boy had been so alive, so full of curiosity and joy, always asking questions about everything from the habits of roadrunners to the stories behind the distant mountain peaks. "Papa, why do some people paint their faces?" Thomas had asked one evening, having seen a group of Apache traders at the general store in town. "It's their way, son," Sam had explained patiently. "Every people has their own customs, their own beliefs. It's what makes them who they are." Margaret had squeezed his arm approvingly. She had always admired his efforts to teach their son tolerance and understanding, even though the volatile situation between settlers and the various Apache bands made such lessons complicated. Now, as Sam walked slowly back toward his house, he wondered if those lessons had died with his family, or if some spark of the man he used to be still existed somewhere beneath the layers of grief and solitude. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind blowing down from the mountains that carried the promise of winter in its bite. Sam had risen before dawn, as was his habit, and completed his morning chores by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline. He was leading Belle and two of the other horses to the creek that formed his property's northern boundary when he spotted something that made him stop abruptly. About 50 yards upstream, partially hidden by a cluster of mesquite bushes, lay the still form of a man. Even from a distance, Sam could see that the figure wasn't moving, and dark stains on the rocks nearby suggested blood. His first instinct was to retreat, to lead the horses back to the safety of his ranch and perhaps ride to town for the sheriff. But something in the way the morning light fell across the scene held him motionless. After securing the horses to a sturdy oak, Sam approached cautiously, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt revolver. As he drew closer, details became clearer. The man was Apache, probably in his 30s, with long black hair and traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. A serious wound in his side had bled heavily, staining the earth beneath him, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Sam knelt beside the wounded warrior, his experienced eye taking in the extent of the injuries. The man had been shot, probably several hours ago, and had somehow managed to drag himself to this spot before collapsing. His horse was nowhere to be seen, likely having fled after its rider fell. Without immediate medical attention, the Apache would surely die within hours. For a long moment, Sam remained frozen in indecision. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to walk away, to let nature take its course. This man could be one of the raiders Carlos had mentioned, possibly involved in attacks on other ranches. By all rights, Sam should feel nothing but contempt for any Apache warrior he encountered. But as he looked down at the dying man's face, Sam saw not a fierce raider, but simply another human being in desperate need of help. The warrior's features, though marked by pain and approaching death, held a dignity that reminded Sam uncomfortably of his own mortality. Here was someone's son, perhaps someone's father, dying alone and far from his people. "Can you hear me?" Sam asked quietly, though he received no response. The Apache's eyes remained closed, his breathing growing more irregular with each passing minute. Sam made his decision. Lifting the wounded man as gently as possible, he managed to get him draped across Belle's back for the journey back to the ranch. The warrior was heavier than his lean frame suggested, and Sam felt every one of his 58 years as he struggled with the dead weight. Back at his house, Sam cleared the kitchen table and transferred his unexpected patient to its surface. He had learned basic field medicine during his younger days, when accidents and injuries were common hazards of ranch life, and his hands moved with practiced efficiency as he cut away the bloodied clothing to examine the wound. The bullet had entered just below the ribs on the left side, angling upward toward the lung. Sam could see immediately that the injury was beyond his limited medical skills. The warrior needed a real doctor, and even then his chances would be slim. But Sam found himself unwilling to simply stand by and do nothing. He cleaned the wound as best he could with boiled water and whiskey, applied pressure to slow the bleeding, and wrapped the man's torso with strips of clean cloth torn from one of his own shirts. Throughout the process, the Apache remained unconscious, though occasionally a soft moan would escape his lips. As Sam worked, he found himself studying the man's face more closely. There were scars on his arms and chest that spoke of a life lived dangerously, but also laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he had known joy as well as hardship. A leather pouch hung around his neck, and Sam could see that it contained what appeared to be small stones or perhaps carved tokens, items of personal significance that spoke of family connections and spiritual beliefs. "What's your name, friend?" Sam murmured as he adjusted the bandages. "Who's waiting for you to come home?" The warrior's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and filled with pain. His lips moved as if he were trying to speak, but no words came. Then his eyes closed again, and his breathing became even more labored. Sam spent the rest of the day monitoring his patient, changing bandages, and trying to get small amounts of water between the man's lips. He found himself talking quietly to the unconscious Apache, sharing thoughts and observations he had kept to himself for years. "I used to have visitors here all the time," Sam said, as he dampened a cloth to cool the warrior's fevered brow. "My wife Margaret. She loved having people over for dinner. She'd cook enough food for an army, and there was always room at our table for one more. Said it made the house feel alive, having it full of voices and laughter." The Apache's breathing seemed to ease slightly at the sound of Sam's voice, though whether this was imagination or reality, Sam couldn't say. As evening approached, it became clear that the warrior was losing his battle with death. His pulse had grown increasingly weak, and his periods of consciousness were becoming shorter and more infrequent. Sam found himself holding the man's hand, offering what comfort he could to someone who was dying far from home and family. "I'm sorry," Sam whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. "I wish I could have done more." The Apache's eyes opened one final time, and for just a moment they seemed to focus on Sam's face. The dying man's lips moved, and Sam leaned closer to catch the whispered words. "White Eagle," the warrior breathed, so softly that Sam almost missed it. Then his hand went limp, and the long struggle for breath finally ended. Sam sat in the growing darkness beside the still form, feeling the weight of an unexpected grief. He had spent 20 years hardening his heart against any sympathy for Apache raiders. Yet here he was, mourning a man whose name he had learned only in the moment of his death. Outside, the wind continued to blow down from the mountains, carrying with it the promise of change. Sam didn't yet know it, but his simple act of compassion for a dying enemy would soon set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Sam spent the night sitting vigil beside White Eagle's body, something he hadn't done since Margaret's passing 20 years ago. As the hours crawled by, he found himself thinking not just about the dead Apache warrior, but about the nature of death itself, how it stripped away all the barriers that separated people in life, leaving behind only the universal truth of mortality. When dawn finally broke, Sam faced a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He could simply drag the body away from his property and let the desert reclaim it, as many settlers would do without a second thought. Or he could bury White Eagle with the same dignity he would afford any human being who had died under his care. The choice, when it came, felt inevitable rather than difficult. Sam had no knowledge of Apache burial customs, but he remembered fragments of conversations with traders and trappers who had spent time among the various tribes. The Apache, he recalled, traditionally buried their dead with personal possessions, and often chose elevated locations that offered views of the surrounding landscape. They believed that the spirits of the deceased needed to see the land they were leaving behind. There was a small hill on the eastern edge of Sam's property, crowned with a cluster of ancient oak trees that had weathered countless desert storms. It seemed like an appropriate place for a warrior's final rest. Sam spent the morning hours digging a grave in the rocky soil, his back aching with each shovelful of earth. The physical labor felt like a form of penance, though he couldn't quite articulate what he was atoning for. When the grave was ready, Sam wrapped White Eagle's body in his finest blanket, a wedding gift from Margaret that he had treasured for decades. The gesture cost him more than he had expected. Giving up this last tangible connection to his wife felt like losing her all over again. But somehow it also felt right, as if Margaret herself would have approved of this act of compassion. Before lowering the body into the grave, Sam made sure that White Eagle's personal possessions remained with him. The leather pouch, a beautifully crafted knife with an elk antler handle, and several other small items that suggested a life lived with purpose and meaning. Sam also added one of his own possessions, a small silver cross that had belonged to his father, not because he thought White Eagle would have wanted it, but because it seemed important that something of himself be buried with this man who had died in his care. As he shoveled earth over the blanket-wrapped form, Sam found himself speaking aloud, partly to White Eagle, and partly to whatever spirits might be listening. "I don't know what you are doing on my land, White Eagle," he said, pausing to lean on his shovel handle. "Maybe you were hunting. Maybe you were running from something. Maybe you just got lost. Doesn't matter now, I suppose. What matters is that you were someone's son, maybe someone's father. You deserved better than dying alone among strangers." When the grave was filled and mounded, Sam constructed a simple marker from stones gathered around the hillside. It wasn't elaborate, but it would serve to mark the spot and perhaps provide some small comfort to White Eagle's people if they ever came looking for him. The work had taken most of the day, and Sam was exhausted by the time he finished, but as he stood beside the completed grave in the golden light of late afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of having done something truly meaningful. For the first time since Margaret and Thomas died, he had acted purely out of compassion, rather than duty or necessity. 3 days passed quietly. Sam returned to his normal routine of tending his horses, maintaining his property, and preparing for the approaching winter. He found himself glancing frequently toward the hill where White Eagle lay buried, but he saw no signs of other Apache in the area. Perhaps the warrior had indeed been traveling alone, and his people would never know what had become of him. On the 4th day, however, everything changed. Sam was repairing a section of his corral when he became aware that he was being watched. It was nothing he could point to specifically, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense of presence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He continued working, but his hand moved instinctively closer to his rifle. When he finally looked up, 3 Apache men had materialized at the edge of his property, sitting motionless on their horses, like shadows given substance. They were perhaps 50 yards away, close enough for Sam to see their faces clearly, but far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening. All 3 were armed, but their weapons remained holstered or slung across their backs. The rider in the center was older than the others, probably in his 50s, with silver threading through his long black hair and the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. His companions were younger, possibly in their 20s or 30s, and they watched Sam with the alert stillness of experienced warriors. For several long moments nobody moved. Sam could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm and keep his hands visible. Any sudden movement could trigger violence, and he was badly outnumbered. Finally, the older Apache nudged his horse forward, stopping about 20 feet from where Sam stood. When he spoke, his English was clear and carefully pronounced, though heavily accented. "I am Running Bear," he said, his dark eyes never leaving Sam's face. "The man buried on your hill, he was my son." Sam felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Of all the possibilities he had considered, this was one he had somehow never fully imagined, that White Eagle's family would actually come looking for him, and that they would know exactly where to find his grave. I'm sorry for your loss," Sam managed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Your son died with dignity. I tried to help him, but his wounds were too severe." Running Bear studied Sam's face for a long time, as if trying to read the truth in his features. Finally, he dismounted and walked slowly toward the corral, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. His companions remained mounted but alert. "Show me," Running Bear said simply. Sam led the 3 Apache men up the gentle slope to the oak-crowned hill where White Eagle lay buried. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, not from the climb, but from the weight of the moment. He had no idea what Running Bear expected to find, or how the Apache leader would react to seeing his son's final resting place. When they reached the stone marker Sam had constructed, Running Bear stood in absolute silence for several minutes, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. His companions flanked him at a respectful distance, their eyes scanning the surrounding landscape with the automatic vigilance of men who had lived their entire lives in dangerous territory. Finally, Running Bear knelt beside the grave and placed his palm flat against the mounded earth. He spoke several sentences in Apache, his voice low and rhythmic, clearly some form of prayer or blessing. When he finished, he remained kneeling for another long moment before rising and turning to face Sam. "You buried him well," Running Bear said, and Sam could hear both surprise and approval in his voice. With his possessions, in a place where his spirit can see the world he is leaving. I tried to do what seemed right, Sam replied carefully. I don't know your customs, but I wanted him to have dignity in death. Running Bear nodded slowly, then walked to the edge of the hilltop where the view opened up across miles of desert and mountain landscape. My son was called White Eagle. He was, restless, always wanting to see what lay beyond the next ridge, always curious about places he had never been. One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly in Apache, and Sam caught what sounded like a question in his tone. Running Bear responded in the same language, then turned back to Sam. My nephew asks why a white rancher would give proper burial to an Apache warrior. It is not usual. Sam considered his answer carefully. Your son was wounded when I found him by the creek. He was dying. I couldn't just let him suffer alone, and I couldn't leave his body for the buzzards. It wouldn't have been... Christian! Christian, Running Bear repeated, seeming to taste the word. You are a religious man? I try to be. My wife was. She taught me that every person deserves compassion, regardless of their race or tribe. Something shifted in Running Bear's expression at the mention of Sam's wife. Was. She is dead. 20 years ago, Sam said quietly. She and my son, both. The two men looked at each other across a gulf of shared loss, and Sam saw something in Running Bear's eyes that he recognized. The hollow ache of a parent who had buried a child. The particular loneliness of a man who had lost the people who gave his life meaning. Running Bear spoke again to his companions, and after a brief exchange, the two younger men mounted their horses and rode back down the hill, leaving the two older men alone beside White Eagle's grave. Sit, Running Bear said, settling cross-legged on a flat stone near the grave marker. We should talk. Sam lowered himself to the ground, his knees protesting the unfamiliar position. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, both men lost in their own thoughts as they watched the shadows lengthen across the desert floor. 20 years ago, Running Bear said eventually, there was much violence between our peoples, many wrongs on both sides, much anger, much fear. Sam nodded, unsure where this conversation was leading, but sensing that it was important. White Eagle was young then, Running Bear continued. Only 6 summers, too young to understand why his mother cried at night, why the men spoke in angry whispers around the fires, too young to understand that some of our young warriors had become reckless in their anger. A chill ran down Sam's spine as he began to sense where this story might be heading. There was a raiding party, Running Bear said, his voice carefully controlled. 8 young men full of rage and whiskey traded from Mexican smugglers. They rode out without permission from the council, looking for easy targets to strike back at the white settlers who had taken our hunting grounds. Sam's mouth had gone completely dry. When was this? Late spring 1867. They attacked a ranch in the eastern part of this territory, a big ranch with many cattle and horses. Running Bear's dark eyes fixed on Sam's face. The rancher's name was Crawford. The world seemed to tilt around Sam as 20 years of carefully buried memories came rushing back with devastating clarity, the sound of gunfire shattering the pre-dawn quiet. Margaret's scream as she pushed Thomas toward the root cellar, the acrid smell of smoke as the barn caught fire, his own desperate ride to town for help, returning to find nothing but ashes and graves. You know this story, Running Bear said quietly, reading the devastation in Sam's face. My wife, my son. Sam's voice broke completely. They died in that raid. Yes, Running Bear said simply. And the boy who led that raiding party was my eldest son. Not White Eagle, but his older brother. His name was Broken Arrow, and he was 17 years old and full of foolish pride. Sam stared at the Apache leader, his mind reeling. Your son killed my family? My son died that day too, Running Bear said quietly. You wounded him as the raiders fled. He made it back to our camp, but the bullet had torn through his belly. He lived for 3 days, long enough to tell me what they had done. Long enough for me to understand that my failure as a father had cost innocent people their lives. The two men sat in stunned silence as the weight of this revelation settled between them. Sam felt as if the ground beneath him had opened up, revealing depths of irony and tragedy that he could barely comprehend. The boy buried here, Running Bear said, gesturing toward White Eagle's grave, spent his entire life carrying the shame of his brother's actions. He never married, never took a place on the tribal council, never allowed himself the happiness he might have had. He said he could not claim joy while the man his brother had wronged still walked in sorrow. "He knew about me?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He made it his mission to know. For 20 years he watched from a distance as you struggled to rebuild your life. When you lost the big ranch and moved here, he knew. When you spent winters alone with no visitors, he knew. When you stood at your wife's grave on the anniversary of her death each year, he knew." Sam felt tears beginning to blur his vision. Why didn't you ever? What could we say?" Running Bear asked sadly. "What words could possibly balance the scales of such loss? We could not bring back your wife and son. We could not undo the pain our family had caused yours." As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the two fathers sat beside the grave of a young man who had spent his life trying to atone for his brother's crimes. The desert wind whispered through the oak leaves above them, carrying with it the weight of 2 decades of grief, guilt, and unspoken sorrow. But it also carried something else. The first faint possibility that healing, however long delayed, might still be possible. The revelation hung between the two men like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. As darkness fell over the desert, Running Bear built a small fire near White Eagle's grave, the flames casting dancing shadows across both their weathered faces. They sat in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts too complex for immediate words. "There is something else," Running Bear finally said, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Something White Eagle carried with him for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to return it." From beneath his buckskin shirt, the Apache leader withdrew a small leather pouch, different from the one White Eagle had worn around his neck. This one was older, more worn, and Sam could see that it had been handled countless times over the years. "The day of the raid," Running Bear continued, "my son Broken Arrow took things from your house before it burned. Most were just possessions, things of value to sell or trade. But there was one item he brought back that he could not bring himself to dispose of." Running Bear opened the pouch and carefully withdrew its contents. In the firelight, Sam could see a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still intact. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized it immediately. "Margaret's locket," he whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the familiar piece of jewelry. "I gave it to her on our 5th wedding anniversary. She wore it every day until the day she died," Running Bear finished quietly. "Broken Arrow found it in the ashes of your bedroom. For reasons he could never explain, he could not destroy it or trade it away. He kept it hidden, and when he died from his wounds, it passed to White Eagle." Sam cradled the locket in his palms, his vision blurred by tears he had held back for 2 decades. With shaking fingers, he managed to open the tiny clasp. Inside, miraculously preserved, was a miniature portrait of Thomas at age 4, his bright eyes and gap-toothed smile exactly as Sam remembered them. "White Eagle told me once," Running Bear continued, "that he believed the spirits of your wife and son were trapped in this locket, unable to rest because it had been taken from them unjustly. He said that until it was returned to you, neither your family's spirits nor his own soul could find peace." Sam could no longer contain his emotions. 20 years of grief, anger, and loneliness poured out of him, in great racking sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. Running Bear sat quietly beside him, occasionally feeding small branches to the fire, allowing the white rancher the release he had denied himself for so long. When Sam finally regained his composure, he found that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The rage that had sustained him through the darkest years was still there, but it no longer felt like a burning coal in his chest. Instead, it had transformed into something more complex, a deep sadness for all the lives destroyed by that single day of violence, including the life of a 17-year-old Apache boy who had made a terrible mistake. "Why now?" Sam asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "Why did White Eagle come here now after all these years?" Running Bear poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. He had been ill, not wounded, sick inside, what you might call consumption. He knew his time was short, and he said he could not die carrying this burden. He came to return the locket and to— The Apache leader paused, choosing his words carefully. "To offer himself for whatever justice you might require." "Justice?" Sam looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "In our tradition, a life debt can be paid in different ways. White Eagle was prepared to offer his life to balance the scales, for what his brother had done to your family. He expected to die on your land, Sam Crawford. He simply did not expect to die of sickness rather than by your hand." Sam stared at the older man, stunned by this revelation. "He came here expecting me to kill him." "He came here hoping you would kill him," Running Bear corrected gently. "For 20 years he had carried not only his brother's shame, but also the weight of your grief. Death would have been a release for him." They sat in silence again as Sam absorbed this information. The idea that White Eagle had sought death as a form of redemption added yet another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. "There is one more thing," Running Bear said, reaching into another pouch at his side. "Something that White Eagle wanted you to have, from his own possessions." He handed Sam a beautifully carved wooden horse, no larger than his palm. It was clearly old, worn smooth by countless hands, and decorated with intricate patterns burned into the wood. "White Eagle carved this when he was 8 years old," Running Bear explained. "It was his most treasured possession as a child. He said he wanted you to have it because your son would never have the chance to carve his own toys." Sam turned the little horse over in his hands, marveling at the skill evident even in the work of a child. The gesture was so unexpected, so purely compassionate that it nearly undid him again. "I don't understand," Sam said finally. "How can I accept gifts from people from the family that destroyed your life?" Running Bear finished. "Because, Sam Crawford, we are the same, you and I. We are fathers who have lost children. We are men who have spent years carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. And because White Eagle's final wish was that somehow, through his death, our two families might find a way to heal." As the fire burned lower, Running Bear told Sam more about White Eagle's life, how he had become one of the finest horse trainers in the tribe, despite his self-imposed isolation, how he had often left food and supplies where struggling families would find them, how he had saved 3 children from drowning in a flash flood 2 summers earlier. "He was a good man," Running Bear said simply. "A man who spent his life trying to atone for something he did not do, but felt responsible for nonetheless." When dawn broke, the 2 men extinguished the fire and stood together beside White Eagle's grave one final time. Running Bear placed his hand on Sam's shoulder, the first friendly human contact Sam had experienced in months. "What happens now?" Sam asked. "Now you decide," Running Bear replied. "You have what was taken from you. You know the truth about what happened that day. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is yours alone." As they walked back down the hill, Sam found himself thinking not about revenge or justice, but about Margaret and what she would have wanted. She had always believed in forgiveness, even when, especially when, it was difficult. She had taught him that hatred was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than its intended target. At the bottom of the hill, Running Bear's 2 companions were waiting with the horses. Before mounting, the Apache leader turned to Sam one final time. "If you ever wish to visit White Eagle's people, to see how he lived and who he was beyond his guilt, you would be welcome in our camp, not as a white rancher or a former enemy, but as a man who showed compassion to our son in his final hours." After the Apache riders had disappeared into the morning haze, Sam stood alone in his yard, holding Margaret's locket and White Eagle's carved horse. For the first time in 20 years, he was not truly alone. He carried with him the spirits of his wife and son, freed at last to rest in peace, and the memory of a troubled young man who had died seeking redemption. The desert wind continued to blow down from the mountains, but now it carried with it not just the promise of change, but the reality of it. Sam Crawford was still a man marked by loss, but he was no longer a man consumed by hatred. And sometimes in the healing of one heart, the possibility of healing for many others begins to take root. That evening, as Sam sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, he found himself speaking aloud to the empty air, not to the dead, but to the living man he was finally ready to become. 20 years is long enough, Margaret, he said quietly, his fingers tracing the outline of her locket. It's time to start living again. In the distance, a nighthawk called to its mate, and for the first time since that terrible day in 1867, Sam Crawford smiled at the sound of life continuing in the wilderness around him. The past would always be with him, but it would no longer define him. He was ready to discover what the future might hold for a man who had learned at last the difference between justice and vengeance, between carrying the dead and honoring them. The story of hatred had ended. The story of healing had begun.